Welcome to the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast. My name is Omri Johnson, your host. I hope you're well. Join me as we continue to deconstruct the shortcomings of traditional DEI strategies and co-create a vision for more transformative, human-centered approaches to inclusion. Myself and my esteemed guests will challenge the status quo, dive deep into the reactive, supplemental nature of many DEI initiatives. We'll explore how to reclaim the profound and transformational potential of inclusion as a catalyst for collective growth, empowerment, and organizational change. Season 2 of the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast starts now. Hello, folks. Hope you are well. Omri here, host of the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast. Today, I have with me somebody who is going to blow your socks off with depth, Mr. Frederick Falker. I saw Fred on a TED Talk, and I didn't know who he was. I was just doing a search on TED Talks, and I was like, whoa, who is this human being that's saying exactly oftentimes what I'm thinking and feeling, and doing it in a way that was so incredibly elegant that I began to try to find him on the internet and eventually stalked him enough that he would have conversations with me. And now we've become pretty good friends. Fred is from the part of the country that I'm close to. I'm from Kansas. Fred's in St. Louis, Missouri. And so I want to just give a heartfelt welcome to Mr. Fred Falker.
Thank you, Omri. I must say, I don't spend a ton of time on LinkedIn, but you are absolutely one of the people that I follow because you are so nice to people that I think you disagree with. And so I'm always curious about how people approach folks in disagreement, but with love. And so that's kind of my sense from you, that the disagreements sometimes are pretty deep. And I'm a person who's not disagreeable, but I disagree with people a lot. And so I've been curious.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I try to go in with love. Sometimes my ego gets in the way of me fully being in that space, but that is the attempt that I try to make. And I being able to engage with people like you allows me to come back to what the principles are. And that's what I'm looking forward to talking about with you today.
Yep.
So Fred, we start off every Reconstructing Inclusion podcast with a couple questions. The first one is, what is your favorite song or a movie that you go to over and over again?
Well, like I said, I'm sort of disagreeable, so I could not come up with a favorite song, but I'm a big jazz fan. And so anything Miles Davis, 1959 on the Kind of Blue album, I could play over and over and over again. But there are lots of pieces that I love. I try never to listen to anything too much because it wears it out. And there's some things that, like maybe a fine cognac or fine whiskey, that you really should not have every day, though you could.
Yeah, in moderation. I think all of us can learn from that. So, second question, one book or one person that has influenced or inspired you personally or professionally in your life or career journey?
Yep. Probably professionally. I had a professor in school. His name was Dr. Robert L. Williams, and Dr. Robert L. Williams is one of the founders of Black psychology. And so it's not something that people have heard a lot, but he's the person that managed to find me and suggest that I could do more than play cards and basketball, and that I might actually make something of my life. So he gave me lots of opportunities. He was a very prominent person. He was also the head of the Black Studies Department at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. And so this is back in the heyday when lots and lots of stuff was going on. We were making lots and lots of mistakes, but people were out there trying.
Yeah. When I was at Morehouse, his name came up amongst all the psychologist on our faculty more than once, and I've had a chance to read some work from him. So that's another connection that I would have never known if I hadn't asked this question. So that's
There are,
fantastic.
yeah, there are a lot of people out there right now that would say exactly what I said about him being that inspiration and that they are where they are right now because of what he did for African Americans
Yeah.
back in 1969
Wow.
and a little bit later.
Wow. Thank you for that. Well, that's somebody you should look up, and I will ask my team to get that in the show notes because that's a
Absolutely.
gem and one that takes me back a long way, and I've learned a lot as a result of his work as well. Um, so tell us about your journey into this work we now call DEI. I imagine you've seen some iterations of this space, so to speak, that we now have labeled. We've labeled it a lot of things. I joke around about this:
That's right.
DEI, DEIJ, Jedi, J, Jedia with accessibility on the end. I've heard it
That's
all.
right.
Maybe I haven't heard Jedia. I just made that up just off the top of my head. But tell us about your journey in your work around this. You don't have to start with your work in diversity. I would like to hear what you didn't choose to do earlier in your career, as we've talked about.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I was in school and majored in Black studies. And one of this was when those programs first started. And one of the things that we did is that we ran a lot of, there were a lot of courses on really racial sensitivity, racial awareness. And they amounted to the Black students in the class and those certainly majoring it, yelling and screaming at white students who came in to be yelled at and screamed at. And so that was, I don't think we thought it was sport, but we thought we were doing based on the times that we lived in. This was the thing to do. And we also thought that we thought that it would work. But I go through school, I finish, I don't, and I declare that I don't want to do any kind of diversity training ever in life. My start really was in developing leadership material and performance management material. And I did that for a number of companies. I did a lot of consultative sales training. And so invariably, I was already doing work in corporate America. People would come to me and say, "Hey, Fred, by the way, yeah, this is the way it works. If you are decent on your feet and you do a good job for people, they will want to hire you again because they know you will never make them look bad." So now people would come and say, "Do you do any diversity training?" I would say, "Absolutely not." First of all, because I disagreed even then with what was being done. So I stayed away from it for 4 or 5 years. And then finally, one customer client came to me and said, "Hey, would you consider?" And I said, "If you give me 6 months." And by then I already had a couple of ideas about what I thought was going wrong at the time. And of course, no one else thought that. And they gave me 6 months or so, and I put together a program. And that was probably 92, 93. And I've been doing that work ever since then. And so now I consider myself to be an inclusion person, but obviously the work is the work, even though I disagree with a lot of what's currently being done. But absolutely, I think I'm still working in the same area and for the
Mm,
same reasons. If you think about outcomes, I just
sure.
think about it very differently.
Yeah. So Fred, you just mentioned something, and I want to go down that track before I get to the next question. You disagree with a lot of what's going on. What exactly do you disagree with?
Well, almost all of it. Again, no, I don't disagree with the purpose, why it's being done or the need for it to be done. I've disagreed almost from the beginning that it could ever actually work. Remember, I said I majored in Black studies, and my
Mm,
mentor, the reason that I'm here was one of the fathers of the Black psychology movement. And even though I am a psychologist by training,
Hmm.
I always disagreed with the idea that there was a Black psychology. In
Mm,
school, I also took Black theology. I also disagree with the idea that there was a Black theology. My background is in developing tests for children. And one of the tests that my mentor developed is called the bitch test. And it's Black intelligence tests of cultural homogeneity. Now, it had another name at first. So the listeners would have to look up what it meant at first. But I disagreed with that as an approach for thinking about intelligence. So I developed a test. So from the very beginning, I've always struggled with this idea of sticking a label in front of something and trying to differentiate in that
mm,
way. And so I started off in that place, even though I was in the field and doing the work. So that's the beginning of the disagreement.
wow. I've been having this conversation with myself the past week, and I think I'm going to write something about it. I don't know when. I was really thinking about this term Black excellence. And
Mhm.
when I thought about it, I was like, I think it limits people of African heritage, of African American culture, because it basically says that your influence is because you're Black, but it also kind of narrows your influence because African American culture has influenced stuff around the world, not just people that are Black doing these things. And so, like, why would you want to put a parameter around excellence? And to me, that what you're saying, it resonates with me because I'm like, okay, there's excellence, and people that are excellent can be from a variety of cultures, and many of them have been of African descent. So why would we have something that becomes this narrow? And it also basically says that nobody else has influenced you as a person who is African American. Well, we know very well we've been influenced by cultures all over the world that brought a lot of things together that produced what we call Black excellence. So is that kind of, are we on the same page with that?
We are absolutely on that page. But if you go back 50 years, the reason for calling those things that was a
Right.
very different reason. At that
Sure.
time,
Sure. Absolutely. That I yes.
it made sense. We
Yeah.
needed to uplift people. We needed to let
Hmm.
the world know that these things
Say
occurred. We needed to as African Americans, we need to let ourselves know that we done
yeah.
it.
Say it loud. Yeah.
That is exactly right. So it made sense then. Now,
Hmm.
does it make sense now? In my mind, no, absolutely not.
Mm.
It does exactly what I think you just saw. It keeps us from seeing the possibilities,
Right.
and it keeps us disconnected and
Mhm.
in trouble,
Mm.
literally as a world, as a group, and things again in my mind they are not getting better.
Yeah. That leads me to my next question, Fred. As I said, I found you out or sought you out without realizing it from your TEDx talk. And the talk is called, and we'll also work to put this in the show notes. It's called From Difference to Distance: Rethinking Diversity and Inclusion. You had a brilliant analogy there, Fred. You used the famous 9 dot puzzle, where to solve the puzzle, one has to link all 9 dots using 4 straight lines or fewer without ever lifting the pin. So you explain this. And it speaks to your philosophy regarding inclusion and inclusive leadership. Can you share more about that part of your talk and how it applies to your approach?
Yeah, I think that's probably the most important thing, not the puzzle, but
Mm,
what I use that puzzle to do. And I
mhm.
use the puzzle to demonstrate, first of all, and I don't think of it as a philosophy, I think of it as a paradigm,
Okay.
that the fundamental paradigm underlying all of diversity work is itself wrong. And so
Mhm.
literally, if you start wrong, you will not ever get it fixed. What happens in the DEI space or the DEI world is a result of the paradigm that it operates in. And so in that context, it makes sense. It made sense to say Black psychology and Black theology in the context of the civil rights movement, of African Americans being led into prestigious universities, and the world was beginning to be different. In the DEI world, it made sense at one time to think about the lines of difference. And that's what I call them. Think about the lines of differences dividing us. But what the 9 dot puzzle attempts to do is to demonstrate to people that we are not divided by our differences. Now,
Mm,
what's always been extraordinary to me is that everybody, almost everybody in the field, seems to get that at one level. So when we talk about race as a social construct, then we're recognizing that it is something that we've constructed. And yet, we still believe that it is out there and that it is real. If it's
mm,
something that we've constructed, it's something in here. And
mhm,
if it's something in here, then it can't be the thing that actually divides us. So the paradigm, and I would call it the difference paradigm, believes that we're divided by the differences that we create. So all differences
mm.
are constructs.
Yeah, and but it seems like we've actually in the amongst practitioners, we've we've invested in these distinctions so much that we believe in a way that the focus on them will create a progress because we'll understand
Yes.
the other, so-called other, better.
Yes.
H- How how do you kind of have that conversation with people that because that's the orthodoxy of a lot of DEI work is our differences separate us and we have to tell people how to get over themselves and understand that differences are good and these people that are not like you usually people that aren't a certain color or a certain religion or a certain ethnicity or gender they're not like you but you need to if you're in the predominant group by
Yeah.
number or by appearance you need to get this. So,
Yes.
I mean, Fred, what you're saying is, that's counterintuitive. Like, who would ever believe that our differences don't divide us?
That is exactly right. Our eyes tell us that our differences divide us. Your ears tell you that you are divided by difference. All of that is true. And so the idea that there is something called that I'm calling the difference paradigm makes absolute sense. It is the way we take in information about the world. We
Mm,
divide the world up by drawing lines to keep ourselves and ours safe, but we create others in the process of doing it.
mm,
We're all born wired to connect. And so literally we're out there reaching and grabbing and pulling in because we need to connect in order to live. One of the first things parents have to do, and grandparents and caregivers, is draw lines for their offspring. We don't draw lines, you explore. By drawing lines, you allow us to take shortcuts. You allow us to perceive the world. The idea that we can survive in the world depends on our ability to draw lines so that we can distinguish between what is helpful to us and what is not. But the fact that we've drawn the lines doesn't make that the reality. It's
mm,
real in the sense that we've drawn the lines. So once we draw a line, we can't unsee it. So our differences are very, very important to us. My differences, very important to me, but nature does not draw lines. Nature didn't do it. And if nature didn't do it, then it might suggest to some people that there is some other issue that causes the very real problems that we have. Because the problems, I think, are real. The idea that they're caused by something that's in your head is not. The conversation in this country right now about Kamala Harris. Is she black or is she is she mixed? Is she bi? Is she of Indian descent? That's a line. That's a line that we draw. Who gets to say, and we have this argument, well, people in the DEI field have the argument all the times, always based on a line. Based on a line, and maybe it's one drop or one quarter or one half. If you're a one quarter Native American or one drop Native American, you're not Native American. We draw the lines. We decide what we want to call what, and then we argue about the line having superiority, that the line isn't controlling. The line is not controlling. We get to change that line any time we want. We won't stop seeing it until we all agree that the line is changed, but we get to change the line. I grew up hearing and believing that there were 9 planets, and Pluto was one of them. They redrew the line. Pluto is now some other heavenly body. We draw the lines, and therefore the lines don't control us. We control the lines. The problem is not that we draw lines. The problem is that we forget that we drew them. The problem is not seeing the lines. That's the point with the 9-dot puzzle.
Right.
So
it just brings me back to you started off talking about race as a social construct. And then you just said all the lines that we draw are just social constructs that we made up in our mind, but we forget that they are.
We forget. That's the powerful lesson, that we forget that we've drawn the line. And since we've drawn it, it can't dictate, constrain us. It can't tell us who to love. It can't tell us who to befriend. It can't tell us where we can't connect. It has no such power. The idea that we see a line instead of seeing an individual is the reason that we have such issues. I always talk about Einstein. There's a reason that I do that on that one particular quote. Is that, and he essentially says that you can't solve the problems with the same level of thinking that created them. Well, the level of thinking that created our problems is the idea that we're going to draw lines. It's as simple as that. We drew the lines. Drawing the lines created the problems, and now we're trying to solve those problems by drawing more lines. Much of what is complex, that we think of as complexity, is actually us trying to explain something that's not explainable with lines. The more lines we draw, the more complex we say that it is. We're creating the complexity, and I think you said it earlier, by drawing more lines. We draw more and more distinctions because we're trying to understand, and we think we could understand it by drawing lines. That only works if you think the world is broken up in pieces, that the world is not one thing. If you think it's pieces of things put together.
Sure. It makes me think of even geographical boundaries on how they've been created over time in nation states and how they've been created and how that's actually shifted a whole kind of cultural homogeneity, or the belief that there's a cultural homogeneity when you go to these places border next to border in various parts of the world, and there's variations, but for all intents and purposes, it's just like, one neighborhood developed different than another, but in terms of their kind of fundamental kind of ways of being with each other, these things evolved out of their interaction with each other in the environment. And there was no line drawn. It was just kind of artificially demarcated.
That's right. And if you didn't draw a line, you wouldn't see a difference.
Right.
That's the other big thing that has to come out of this new thinking.
Right.
That you don't see differences if you don't draw lines. What you see is variation. The drawing of the line creates the distinction. The drawing of the line is what divides. And when we divide, it brings in appraisal and judgment. It brings in the idea that something could be less than or more than.
Mhm.
All of our bias is created by drawing lines. We can't get rid of bias and you can't get rid of drawing lines, but you can recognize that the lines that we draw are not real in the sense that they are out there.
Right.
People could not solve the 9 dot puzzle because they saw the line. The name of the puzzle is not just 9 dots. Some people call it thinking outside the box puzzle,
Yeah.
except that
I,
there is no box.
there is no box. That was the first thing that came to my mind. There is no box.
There is no box.
Um, wow. So I know you don't spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, but occasionally I'm blessed to have you come in and comment on a thread that I'm on or one of my posts. And you said something that struck me recently. You said the problems in the DEI field predate the hype.
Yeah.
The shotgun marriage between social and racial justice and people working in the field magnified the existing problems. And then you went on in the same thread. Our current thinking and way of seeing the world holds us back. We will founder until we question the fundamental assumptions of orthodox DEI thinking. You've gone into that a little bit. Could you go a little deeper into that wisdom, or particularly around the shotgun marriage?
Yeah, the shotgun marriage has happened, actually a number of times. This one was more predominant. So when you don't have as many years of experience as I do, you haven't seen these
Mm,
things come together and you haven't seen the reaction that comes from what happens out there in the world.
hmm
In this particular marriage, we get George Floyd in the States. And now we get lots of people recognizing what they should have recognized a long time ago, which is that we've got tremendous disparities. There's lots and lots of places where police are abusing people of color. I mean, this is when I talk about this, I think back to the comedians that I grew up with. There is no black comedian that has ever lived that didn't have a joke, even though it wasn't funny, but it was sort of about what police do to black people. Black people have been lynched in the United States. It's been like that. But something about this time and this having the camera on it made this one very different. So now in the United States, CEOs are signing up for it. And so lots of people who are really in the social justice field, and by the way, I have no problem with social justice field. It's just not part of DEI work. Now bring those ideas into the field and marry them with what was going on in the diversity awareness field. And so now we're going to come in and say, we the job of an organization is to get rid of disparities. The job of the organization is to do this. So now you've got a lot of people that are in some ways activists. Again, my issue is not against activists. I didn't go to Washington University in St. Louis without activism. If a group of students didn't go to the college, to our campus headquarters, to the chancellor's office and take over the building, that's activism. And that allowed somebody to say, we are excluding people, not because they can't do the work, but because we can.
hmm
So some people like me go to school because of that. I'm in favor of activism, but activism gets a foothold. And I hear you talking oftentimes about, yeah, we've gotten this foothold and now look, what are we doing? Now we're stuck believing that affirmative action, we're stuck believing these things must continue in order for us to move along. So these things lock us into place and they shouldn't. So we can really change all of this.
Fred, some people actually made their whole so-called DEI practice about racial social justice.
Sure.
Now, some people believe that that's the heart of DEI and that's all DEI should be about. And,
Right.
you've had this recent kind of upheaval among some DEI people about SHRM getting rid of the E in DEI in terms of their practice by
Yep.
focusing on the I and the distinctions, the differences, the similarity, or the D. How do you kind of help people understand this distinction that social racial justice is not DEI work, or it was not DEI work until this shotgun marriage occurred?
Well, one thing in this I think is important for me is that DEI is not the God. DEI is
Mm,
the way that you're trying to accomplish something. I think people get in professions and then they hold the profession up, and the profession itself becomes important. The idea that you would change the name
mm,
from DEI to DEIB or to IEB, none of that actually matters whatsoever. All of that is absolutely political. I mean, it is only done for one reason. And so, well, I shouldn't say one reason, because some people actually have fervent beliefs that this word or that word should go first. But Sherm's decision is a political, in my mind, it's a
mm.
political decision. We can re-emphasize the words, reorganize the chairs on the deck of the Titanic. The ship is still going to sink if we don't change. And when I say sink, I don't mean that it's going to go away. I don't think
Right,
that's going to.
right.
We know that it's necessary and we hope that it gets better. But this is one of the few fields that you could spend billions and billions and billions of dollars on and in and produce as little results as we've managed to produce.
That's tough to hear. It's not tough for me because I've been
Right. Well, I
listening,
know.
saying it for a
I,
while.
I know.
But for a lot of people, it's tough to hear. What would happen if we could question these fundamental assumptions as practitioners, as people who are so-called DEI positive? How can we prevent this and already floundering our foundering dynamic of the field? What can you think we need to question to move from where we are to the outcomes that, in a way, for lack of a better word, justify the levels of investment that we're making into organizational life?
Well, I think what's important, I've proposed a new paradigm, and you only get to call something a new paradigm when you realize it's replacing an old paradigm, and whether it
Hmm.
is or not is really for others to determine.
Right.
But that new paradigm suggests again that we're not divided by our differences. So the lines that we see don't divide us. You
Mm.
can cross them and or not see them at any time you want. So then what explains disparities? What explains bias? What explains how the world is? Because we're doing a pretty decent job of explaining what we see.
Right.
Where we're confused is that we're looking at the stuff that we've created and believe that's the problem. So I believe that we're not divided by our differences, but we are absolutely separated from one another because we don't know one another. And so, in my mind, we are separated by distance. Not only do we not know one another, we don't actually, in many cases, want to know one another. The entire DEI movement actually keeps us fragmented. It keeps us
Mm.
divided. It keeps us separated from one another. It suggests that we get to know them by getting to know them. So if I know,
Wait. I want to make sure everybody heard that. I need to make sure they heard that.
uh,
The them, just say that again, because I heard it and it resonated with me. Them, to get rid of them, or to say that again, Fred.
to get to know Fred in the
Right.
DEI world, I mean, they don't,
Hmm.
no one is saying this. You need to understand African American men of a certain age.
Hmm.
That's insane. It's,
Hmm.
that's crazy. There's no part of me that you would know by knowing African American men of a certain age. If you want to get to know me, there's only one way to do it. If you want to connect to another human being, you connect to that human being. The way the movement is set up, the way we believe right now is I come to know you by knowing them. So if
Mm,
I understand African Americans, if I understand any particular group, then I believe I know something about you. I know about you, but the problem with us as human beings is knowing about people as a group. And we all know this, and yet we stay with it, is not knowing who they are. To know who they are, then we have to see the world differently. If I'm looking at differences, I can't be seeing you. If I'm looking at you, then I'm seeing past the lines. So here's the line that constrains me. I'm looking at the line, trying to connect to the line instead of the human being. As long as the line stands between you and I'm not ever really seeing you. You are invisible to me. I
mhm.
mean, I might have mentioned to you that one of my favorite works was Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man. And in the very beginning, he talks about they see figments of their imagination. The DEI field is creating figments of imagination all the times by suggesting that we see people purely through this lens of the box. That's what I call it sometimes, that they belong to. In order to understand this person, you must understand their culture. You must understand their trauma, what they've gone through, what they've suffered, what they're currently doing. You have to get that first.
Mm,
Getting that is knowing about and not knowing. We come to
yeah,
know each other as human beings by moving toward each other. So that suggests if there are no lines between us and yet we have issues, what is it? Well, the from difference to distance. The idea is that we are separated. I don't like to use the word divine because I don't want to have the two paradigms
uh,
confused.
got it.
We are separated by the distance that we place between ourselves and other human beings. Notice that it's not there until we place it there. We're
Mhm.
born connecting. We're born doing this. We are born closing distance. Our parents, by drawing lines, say, well, you can close the distance with mom or dad or grandma or those two neighbors, with your brother and sister, but you can't close the distance with line. People like that. You can't close the
Right.
distance with line, that group. Now, when we see that line, we stop. The line didn't stop us because the line isn't out there. We
Wow.
stopped ourselves from moving toward them. The DEI world makes it worse by
Mm,
now spending time doing everything it can to keep us focused on the thing that's not real instead of what is. If
right.
what is, we could connect. And how do you do that? Then you want to teach people how do you do it? The truth is, we already know how to do
You know
it.
how to do it. Wow.
We've
You know,
always done it. We just won't do it with certain people where we see the line. So everything that talks about the line is
wow. The,
fundamentally wrong.
yeah, it is. And it brought me to thinking about, the fact that I was really, in a way, I wasn't initially when I first got into the space, but the more I was inside working with employee resource groups, there was always like this desire to break them all up, right? So you had to have a LGBTQA plus group, you had to have a Black group, you had to have a Latino group, you had to have a parents group, and then you had to have a women's group, and and so people were coming to me when I went inside, and I was responsible for the budget, saying we want to have this group, and I was like, yeah, no, and it shifted once I left the company. They moved to that kind of group structure, but I think it actually doesn't do organizations a service to perpetuate that because it makes it seem like this group is for one entity that looks like a particular thing or identifies with a particular way of being in the world. That's really hard to shift people out of. And I've been
Yes.
trying for a while to move out of that space because people say, well, they have safe space to talk about what's there. And my thing is, don't we want safe space to talk about things across all of our differences and similarities?
Yeah.
It's like, how do you shift people? Because that your paradigm to reduce this distance, to this separation by we've had this distance between each other. The paradigm of DEI has been perpetuating this so hard. If what would you say to a practitioner that argued back to you, no, we have to have things like ERGs, we have to talk about how we're different, or it's not DEI. What would
Yeah.
you say to them?
I certainly wouldn't argue about the paradigm because I understand that paradigms shift over time. There are people who believe
Yeah, yeah.
paradigms don't shift until the people who hold onto them are all dead. And so in some ways, I have always approached my work as some people will shift and some people won't. When
Mm,
Tesla first came out, some people said, you got to be kidding me. Some people went to it pretty quickly. Well, that shift has not occurred yet. The shift between from difference to distance, the best way to deal with it is ask people, are you getting the outcomes that you want? Can you
mm,
imagine in your head things being different for your grandchildren based on what we are currently doing? Or does something miraculous have to occur if you don't believe that it will be better for your grandchildren? Because I'm sure you don't believe it's going to be better for you.
mm,
Again, I've been doing this kind of work for much longer than most people, and things are better around the margins. There's no doubt about it. There are a lot of good things that have happened, but the
mhm.
disparities haven't changed.
Yeah.
Where DEI now argues about giving a person a seat at the table or making sure that there's representation so I can see people that look like me. That's not anything that's different from 60 years ago. If in 60 more years we're still where we are, and everything that I see suggests that we have to be. You can't school or educate or shame people out of the stories that they believe to be true. You
Mm,
can't elevate yourself in a conversation saying you don't have any power when in fact what you're doing is causing them to resort to violence or shut up and be silent. You can't continue. And I see that on a lot of stuff that you write, where you just ask people simple questions that they will not go there. But in part, they won't go there because they don't have a place to go. In other words,
right.
if bad smells don't cause disease, what? Well, you got to
Mm,
have some place else to go. So somebody has to propose. Somebody else has to say, here's another place to look. The hard thing about paradigm shifts is getting people to look in this new place when there's so much holding on to the place that they know. So we understand the difference model, and a lot of it makes sense, and some of it has done some good. And when I think about the difference model, when I was in school, it was really difference deficit. Robert L. Williams, one of the things he talked about is that differences don't mean deficiencies. So you
mhm,
had to talk about difference. You had
right.
to talk about cultural difference. You had to say that in this culture, they do this, and
Mhm,
this.
mhm, mhm.
There's a reason to talk about Black excellence because there's all but that takes you so far. The truth is cleaning up dead animals. I know some people don't know what I'm talking about. Cleaning up dead animals out of the street, you know, using soap and water made a difference in terms of diseases. But it could only go so far. DEI, as it's currently practiced, in my opinion, has gone as far as it can go. It
Mm,
gets more and more complicated. You literally cannot explain it to another human being who is not in the field. You literally can't tell them what it is that you're talking about it. And the so-called experts argue over and over again about what this word means or that word means or what the true definition is. You can't have a world where there are only a few experts
Mm.
telling other people how to live. The heroes of whether the world gets to be better. And I think we talked a little bit about Joseph Campbell. The
Mhm.
heroes are the people who have to who have to be different. And if we can't help them be different, we're failing. Nothing in the current work is helping anybody be different. We come at them with so much, I don't want to call it gobbledygook, but a lot of it actually is.
I've used that word more than once.
Okay.
So I'm going to move towards our final question because I know we could talk for another couple hours, Fred, and we might have to come back, particularly when your book comes out. So when your book comes out, you're coming back on the
Right.
Reconstructing Inclusion podcast.
Yeah.
All that you said completely resonates with me. Right now, we're seeing so-called DEI backlash. To me, it's not new. I've seen, this kind of form of the matrix before, so it's not new to me. But to a lot of people, I actually saw an article that somebody wrote. Spend way too much time on LinkedIn, obviously. Somebody wrote about this gentleman who is pushing back on DEI and getting companies to stop their DEI efforts, which I don't necessarily believe is true. I think that people might have made a political decision, but if they were serious about creating the conditions for their people to thrive, they didn't stop DEI. They maybe stopped calling it that.
Yeah.
But that's to be seen. But gave this gentleman a lot of attention, who, and I think that's his main modus operandi, is attention and fame and ability to make money from this media attention he's getting. But the person who wrote the article, and she's somebody, I've seen. She's newer she's younger in the field, and I think she's has great intentions. And I think the way she responded to his rhetoric was actually playing into exactly what he wanted her to do. So they were basically playing this yin yang game, but not with all the, you know, depth of the changes in a yin and yang cycle. What's my point here? What do you say to some of these people about how to respond to the DEI pushback, if we'll call it that? How do you respond to it? What do you say to those who are pushing back? And what do you say to those who are so-called DEI champions or supporters who are pushing back against the pushback?
Yeah. I think we need to figure out how to see the patterns that are occurring. There are people in the field who are pushing back against people who are attacking them, and yet they have a hard time seeing how people outside of this field are pushing back against them attacking them.
Mm,
First, stop worrying about the people that are attacking you and start thinking about how do you in fact get better. The pushback only works to the extent that there is some sampling or evidence that it's true or that it's not good for people. We
mhm,
spend our time attacking the attackers as opposed to making sure that the thing that we're doing is actually working. There's way too much attention being paid to what label we stick on a word, what we
mhm,
call something, and almost no attention being paid to whether or not what we're doing is actually having the desired outcome, the desired impact. In fact, I rarely hear anybody in the field talk about anything regarding outcomes. We don't talk about outcomes. We talk about activities. We talk about the dogma. We talk about what we've decided must be the case. We gather evidence that our model is working. We don't ever look at could something work better than this? And the evidence is so scant. We never talk about the evidence that says that it doesn't work. What I'm suggesting is, I'm just saying, I think it doesn't work. And I think if you actually could get outside of the bubble for a moment, you would see that even the evidence suggests that it doesn't work. And yet some evidence suggests that it does. Well, what does that tell you? It tells you it's not doing enough, that everybody should be focused on doing the same thing over and over again, hoping that things will get better.
Mm,
We have to be able to do something different. I'm
mm,
proposing, I'm suggesting that the problem is that we don't do enough to know each other as human beings.
right.
And that if you come to see people as human beings, you will think about them differently. When you see them, it's hard to harm people that you can see. It's
Yeah.
hard to hurt people that you can see. It's when you identify with somebody's story, you begin to connect to them. We
Hmm.
talk about empathy and all of these things that are in the literature all the time, and we know that those things are true, and yet we operate in the current DEI space as if none of that's true. We've
Mm,
made up this elaborate world that I call the DEI world now, that is doing so little for us. Better
mm,
than nothing. Absolutely. I
mhm,
would not get rid of it, but to act like we can't see that it's creating the problems.
mhm,
I see you asking that question all the times.
mm,
Is that creating our problem when you say that one group of people, we wonder in the US why 60% or 70% of white males would vote for Donald Trump? You've spent the last 20 years attacking them. Now, I'm not saying that all of them are there because they've been attacked, but I know if you attacked me for 20 years, I think I probably wouldn't be in the camp with you. I
absolutely.
think that there would be reasons for me, just out of anger or trying to keep my story that I believe is true, even though I think all the evidence says that it's not. We are creating the world that we have. We don't want to see ourselves as co creators. We don't want to see ourselves in relationship with others. We have to be able to, the distance model, by the way, allows you to see that. We now
Right.
start thinking about relationships, us over objects, groups,
Wow.
us and them. What is the relationship I have with this person?
Mm,
Not are we divided by our differences? What is the relationship I have with this person? Am I close or am I far away? Can I see them as in being a human being, or do I see them as an object? As long as DEI has us see other people as objects, nothing will ever change.
I think that is the space we will begin to transition to close on. You've left me with a lot to contemplate because the one thing I think is really big is you've just asked us as practitioners to hold the mirror up to ourselves, but also to know that we can't always see ourselves so clearly. So we need to connect in order to see ourselves clearer. And so I profoundly appreciate that. Fred, is there anything that I missed that I should have asked you that I didn't?
I think and I don't think this is a miss. I think in the work that I've done, because again, I've been doing this for a while, that there are people who will hear the thinking and say, "Hey, I like pieces of it." So people will maybe use distance occasionally, and they'll occasionally talk about, well, that's a line, and maybe we shouldn't use that line. You don't change a paradigm by staying where you were.
Mm,
So to change a paradigm, you literally abandon the way you have seen the world. You abandon. So I don't use the word diversity because you stay stuck in the world of us being divided by differences. So I would almost never say DEI unless I'm talking to a DEI person.
mm-hmm.
And if I did use DEI, it would be distance. So it's distance and not diversity. I don't use the word diversity. I think we should look at our language if we want to see how the language itself introduces conflict. The language that we have is the language of the struggle, the language of war. It's not that that language is not necessary, but when that language is taken into an organization, and then you wonder why so many people in that organization don't buy what you're saying, you are bringing conflict with you. I'm not saying you started it, but to act like you're not continuing to be part of it is to not be able to see yourself in that mirror. We are part of every relationship that we're in. We are never a lesser part. You know, we can define power in all the ways you want to, but you could stop dancing. You don't have to continue doing the steps. And if you don't want to be part of that relationship, well, if you don't want to be part of it, you have to change your behavior. And our behavior right now perpetuates the world that we have. And the world that we have right now is a divided world. It is a divided world where we are less human to one another than we could be if we could see that we're not divided by those lines that we draw. See them, respect them, embrace them, but stop believing that they divide you from other human beings, because they do not. You divide yourself from them by believing that they are real. They aren't.
Folks, Fred, Falker, thank you, sir, for leaving us better than we were before hearing from you. Hope this was helpful, folks. Let us know in the comments how helpful it was. Make it a great day. Peace.
Peace. Thanks, Alry.
If you are committed or simply a little bit curious about how to make DEI accessible to everyone, actionable, that is, unambiguously prioritized and sustainable, aligned with personal and organizational purpose, hit the subscribe button. Make it a great day. Peace.